And so does that put us into a bind? And that's what he's going to say. So our opponents will say, see, look, it's arbitrary. Great.
Right. You admit it, right?
Right.
I won.
Yeah, there you go. All right, walk away. We're all done. So that option is a reductio ad absurdum against the divine command theory. That is, if the divine command theory really does imply that we would be obligated to rape had God commanded it, then the divine command theory is obviously wrong. Well, I mean, he doesn't talk about it here, but I think that goes back to your worldview. Who cares? What? So what? Again, we have this understanding that we want to bring in a value of other people's well-being, or a sense of building a stronger community, a sense of survival. But at the same time, okay, fine, but I don't agree. Therefore, I can do whatever I want, right? And I'm only constrained by the might makes right of society, or the law, or my own value at the time of decision. And so he's going to speak against that. Sanat Armstrong, I like this quote here, and I think it illustrates it well. If a divine command constitutes our moral duty not to rape, for example, then what makes it morally wrong to rape is just that God commands us not to rape. Moreover, when God commands us to do or not do any act, we have a moral duty to do or not do that act. I find this view incredible. If God commands us to rape, that command would not create a moral requirement to rape. Moreover, even if God in fact never would or could command us to rape, divine command theory still implies the counterfactual that if God did command us to rape, then we would have a moral obligation to rape. That is absurd. And so this is, to take it out of the whole rape category, this is what I think it's Bertrand Russell. If you died and went to God and faced him, what would you say? And he'd shake his fist and say, "Not enough evidence."
That's right.
And so that's been the kind of the new atheist mantra as well. And so I think that is another question that brings up of, are we actually trying to get to truth and having consistency, or are we just trying to find evidences towards our own position? And so I think that's not covered here, but I think that's definitely an important question that needs to be asked as well. So this is an actual argument, arbitrariness. Okay, who cares?
Yeah, did Senator Armstrong give us an argument?
No, this is absurd. I don't like this.
Yeah, that's an argument?
Right, that's his argument.
Yeah.
It assumes that this is a poor choice, but, again, that's not an argument. Notice something else he says. If morality depends on what God thinks, then it's not independent of whether anyone thinks so, and then morality is not objective. And so he and I are in agreement here. Morality, on my view, isn't objective in the sense of person independent, it's person dependent. So then what does that mean? What person is it dependent on?
Right. So what he's doing here is going through several objections to the divine command theory. The first one is this arbitrariness objection, right? And he kind of says, so he looks at this and he says, no, it is person independent, right? Or it's not, rather. It is dependent. It's person on dependent. Dependent on person. The next one then is the objection of, then why do you call God good? Right? So that's the next objection. He says there's a common objection level at the divine command theory, one that can be encouraged by the way we theists describe God's nature. Again, Senator Armstrong objects that according to traditional theism, God is all good, right? Okay. And from that, this fact, theists go on to conclude that God must be loving, generous, faithful, kind, and so on. His objection says this line of reasoning assumes that it is good to be loving, generous, just, faithful, and kind, and those things. The complaint then seems to be that we can't identify God as good without falling into a trivial tautology, right? In other words, it goes something like this. And he talks about Louis Anthony here. Objects that the divine command theorists are using the term good merely as a synonym or placeholder for commanded by God. But we're not allowed to do this, right? God is where we get our definition of good in the first place. So to say that God is all good is merely to say that God is like God, Well, we haven't said anything, right? God is all good. What does that mean? Well, God is like God. Well, wait, what is,
A equals A.
Right.
All right.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yes.
So he says, okay, fair enough, right? He says, fair enough. So he's going to say, maybe we shouldn't say it that way, right? He says, let's remedy this problem by refraining from phrases like God is good, at least while we're doing philosophy here, right? Otherwise, we can go for it, is what he says. Instead, he says, we'll just simply say that God's nature determines what's good. And so now he's kind of met that particular objection. All right, fine, I'll give that to you. Mm-hmm. That's a tautology. That's just repeating, redundantly saying that. So he says, okay, fine, let's use God's nature determines what good. The main thing, though, that he wants us to remember in any case is that good is defined as what God values. Mm-hmm. So that's it's arbitrariness objection, and now we might call it the tautology objection, right? And you can get around that, he suggests, by saying, well, God's nature determines what's good. Right.
So you've added something to the argument there.
Yeah.
So why should we obey God? How is morality any different from etiquette or fashion? What is coolness? Well, coolness is just things that people like, so that they value it. That whatever popular people happen to like, it thereby becomes cool. If that's the case, then there's nothing inherently true about cool things that gives them their status. Okay, fair enough. And in one sense, that's correct. But what makes morality different from coolness is that it's God who determines the standard of morality, not merely humans. So again, there's this separation of yes, there's persons, and so we're not outside the bounds of our definition of person's value. Mm-hmm. Persons give value to things or ideas, but God is different than humans, and so the qualities that make up God are important here. So if humans were the final rule in morality, the point would be have more weight. In fact, it's spot on. Of course, this appeal to a difference between God-ordained morality and human-ordained coolness isn't going to impress this person, and she'll doubt whether God can make enough of a difference. And so the real question is this. Here it is. What is it about God that makes him relevantly different from humans? Why should we obey God? Is it because if we weren't, we'd be punished? Okay, or is it because he created us and so has authority over us? I think that's an interesting point. These strike people as less than admirable reasons for doing what God says, and atheists have had a lot of objections to that. So Antony here says, one does not owe allegiance to another being simply because the being is stronger, and it doesn't matter if the being in question is responsible for your very existence. No one thinks that an absurd abused child is morally obligated to obey abusive parents, and so those are some of the things that we see. And so we shouldn't follow God just because he created us. So, what's the point of following God? Why should we? That's her objection, right? Yeah.
All right, fine. So he created you. So what? Does that mean that you have to do everything he says, right? Yeah. Or he is stronger than you. Yeah. So that means whatever he tells you to do.
Give the bully the lunch money.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And so, yes, there is some points to be made here. And so this is why we always have to be careful with our definitions and our argumentation. Obligations aren't simply things we just have to, but are moral and therefore person-dependent on Dr. Stokes' account. Most theists, or at least many that I know, aren't motivated primarily because God is stronger, nor even simply because he created them. They obey God because they want to. On the other hand, God's authority and power are nothing to sneeze at because God is in charge of the cosmological establishment. He can be its lawgiver. And I think that's very important here to, when we talk about question of authority and things like coolness, we're defining a group of people who think that's cool. And maybe it's just you. Well, I think it's cool. Right. And therefore you put yourself as an authority of whatever coolness factor is, or you say a lot of people think beards are cool, and so, well, okay, are you putting that in the reform camp? And if you don't have a beard, you can't be reformed, or are you putting that in kind of the yuppie hipster movement? And so hipsters think beards are cool, and so therefore it's again person dependent. It's not so it's technically maybe what might makes right, but God's infinite power is certainly one of those things that sets him apart from human lawgivers. And so when we talk about the law doesn't make things moral. Well, yeah, that's very true. Right. However, if you have perfect people that can determine, everything that could come about and all of the objections raised, and determine if when a law should come into an account, then there's way more value in that law than just an arbitrary, we're responding to terrorist attack, and so we need the Patriot Act to come in to be able to spy on you to help protect you. Well, what if we had that maybe, 6 months before 9/11? Would that have solved anything? I'm not trying to make that argument here or there, but if you have people that see the history from above it, if they're not involved in it, if they're not human and don't have a physical spot in the universe, then there's more to the argument than just it's just arbitrary. God is different than humans. So this is one reason why atheists find God so distasteful. They can see him as an overbearing authoritarian dictator.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. So he just tells us he bosses us around. He's a dictator, right? Right. We have to do it.
Yeah. Jeez. But most theists see it differently, viewing God as a loving father who cares for them and as someone they can trust, despite not fully understanding why he is doing the things that he does.
Right. So there's a distinction here between dictator and a loving father. Right. Yeah. And of course, we do want to follow and obey a loving father. I mean, we have to follow a dictator, right? Right. But we want to follow a loving father.
Right. I know this more now than ever being a father myself. Don't sit on the couch like that. Oh, I'm just being overbearing. That's what my daughter thinks. And so I have to bring her over and I say, no, if you fall backwards, you're going to really, hurt yourself. Yeah. And so there's an explanation there that I'm giving that says I'm doing this command, not because it's arbitrary, but because I was there, or I can see the bad outcome. You're not stable enough. I need you to grow up a little bit more. And so I'm giving you this command to do it. And then I'm explaining the reason for it. So I'm doing it because I love my children.
Right. So God doesn't do it because we don't obey necessarily because of punishment and that sort of thing, right? There's other motives, right?
And so rather than obey often enough because that children love their parents, because they love their parents, feel loved by them, are grateful for the care and comfort that parents provide. There's a sense of loyalty, belonging. All these things is what Christianity talks about, being sons and daughters and the children of God. This is the same type of language that Christians use.
Right. So her objection was that, hey, the only reason why you're obeying God is because he's a bully and you're fearful of punishment.
Or he's abusing you.
Right. Or the only reason why you obey God is because, he created you. Well, just because parents, have offspring, that doesn't necessarily mean. And he says, no, those are not necessarily the reasons, at least for the Christian, right? We obey God because he loves you and you love God. Right? There's a relationship there, right? A parent and child type of relationship. Parents obey their parents, or children obey their parents because they love them, or at least, as they get older, they do. We would hope, right?
They rebel just as we rebel against God. But the bottom line is this: we obey God because we want to, and we want to because we value certain things. And thankfully, God can influence our values. Again, I write my law upon their hearts, and I change their hearts from a heart of stone into a heart of flesh. We are being given a divine sense, a renewed change in our value. That's what Christians have been saying about salvation is my values for my sin, myself, how I look at the world, completely changed once I became a Christ follower, and there's a divine influence there that Christians claim occurs, and so then it's a sanctification process is what we call it, a continuation of changing and growing and understanding, just like a child does as they grow older and we rebel and we still have our, don't bite your fingernails, please. I've told that so many times. Well, why is that? Because I don't want your fingers to get hurt, but you keep doing it because it's a bad habit. And so, it's not a perfecting thing, because it's not a complete overriding of who we are. because God values us. Little sermon there. So God absolutely must influence our values before we want to obey him, before we value the things he values through regeneration, sanctification. God is said to change our hearts, to change what we value. In this case of Christianity, God values are becoming our values. Morality requires persons, and now we come up to a further objection here.
Yeah. So really, so he ends this chapter with a series of questions that he really hasn't dealt with, right? He says there are some important but irrelevant. He thinks these questions are irrelevant, right? So he says, I've really only given a thumbnail sketch of how God might ground morality. There are many more questions, he says, that might reasonably be asked about the divine command theory, right? And many of them, he says, are epistemological. That is, they have to do with what we can know, right? Epistemology is a study of kind of the nature of knowledge and truth and that sort of thing. So, for example, how do humans know which God, right? That's an important,
very important
question. Of all the religions we should obey. Similarly, how do we know what God's commands are, right? Also, what are the real origins of our moral intuitions or belief? Is God the source of these beliefs? Do social biological explanations of our moral beliefs, if true, count against the divine command theory? Can our moral beliefs have both a natural and supernatural origin? Right? Suppose, moreover, that we have in mind the God of the Old Testament and the New Testament. How do we reconcile some of the embarrassing, right, passages?
So embarrassing.
Yeah, God commands Abraham, for instance, to kill Isaac. Which other parts of the scriptures that seem to portray God as someone who would do such things? So these are important questions, he says, but they're really irrelevant to the point that he's trying to make.
Right.
He says the answer to these questions are important, but of little substance, turns on them for what I'm arguing. Moreover, even if my account of how God grounds morality is wrong, indeed, even if there is no God at all, this wouldn't affect my main point about morality.
Interesting.
And what is it? It's that if there is no God, then morality depends ultimately on human tastes and desires. And so he says he's added the discussion of how God might ground morality in order to allay some of the pretty obvious concerns about my person-dependent theory of values. So notice, if no God, then it depends. It's not independent. Morality becomes, because you have to have a person. That's what he's saying. You have to have a valuer in order to have morality. You have to have someone who values something. So if there's no God, then it falls on us, right? Our taste, our desires. And so that's why he says he's trying to make a point here.
Right. And so then we need to be careful if that were true. We've been evolved to have empathy for people, and so we should follow that. Okay, well, what if I don't want to? I can go against that. It's not, an evolutionary explanation might be helpful. I'll grant that. But there's nothing that says that we should be empathetic because our nature tells us to, because I can always go against that. It's. In fact,
that's the point, right? That's what we have choices to make with regard to what we are going to do and not do.
Right,
morally speaking.
Is it empathetic to save my child from a bus than somebody else's child? Well, that's an arbitrary decision then, right? So there's no when there's a moral claim there, there is, and so there's no answer to it if it's just, well, I preferred my kid over the other one, but what if the other kid is the next Einstein, or what
my kid is.
I mean, that's true. my child is objectively cute. That's my joke. And so I guess he will deal with moral nihilism next, and we'll come up to the final couple chapters here. Why should unbelievers then do what God commands? That's a big one too.
Right. So if they do, there's lots of answers to that, right?
Oh yeah.
But so the question could be, why should unbelievers, if God is not the ground of morality, then all they have is themselves, right? And so, do you really want your desires or other people's, humans' tastes, right, their desires, to be the ground of morality? And he's suggesting, look, you have to have a valuer in order to have values. Moral values need a person, a valuer. So it's either you stuck as an unbeliever with yourself or somebody else or other people.
Right.
Or you have this transcendent God who is confined, constrained, he says, by his nature, so that that is the ground, the foundation of it. And then we find that out by his commands with regard to, what he tells us to do in terms of what we should or ought to do.
And he does call people from a Christian perspective to come to value what he values, to come to trust in him, to be changed. Now, there's implications to that we're not going to get into here. But it's not. This isn't like a subspecies. Like Christians aren't a subspecies of or the perfect species, and then all the unbelievers are the icky Morlocks that hide under the earth and carry us away. Right. There's a call.
They're neither icky nor Morlocks.
Right. Some of you might be, just as some of us are.
Yeah. So why should the unbeliever? Well, there are lots of reasons, right? For instance, God commands us to do things for our good, right? So the unbelievers should seek
because of who God is, his nature.
He's
perfect. He sees outside time. He can see what's best for you, and so
they should do what God commands. Otherwise, they're stuck with what they desire and what other people desires, and how do you choose between those? There's how is that not arbitrary?
A purposeless universe where you're stuck in sin, whether or not you believe in sin. I mean, there's a Calvin calls it a sensus divinitas, that there are ways that people act that they don't even know, and this is one of the things that presuppositionalists point to, that point towards their understanding that there is a God. And so there's a desire to live consistently, why many skeptics aren't skeptical enough, is the subplot of the book. And so that's what would be the call here too, is live consistently. That's what we all recognize is the best argument is one without inconsistency, and so you should throw it all away and understand arbitrariness. And so your suggestion that the Holocaust is bad is just yours, and you can group a few people together.
Hitler certainly didn't think so.
Right. And so, live consistently. And so that's what Christians call even unbelievers. And so, in Romans 1, Romans 2, even the Gentiles form these laws and then go against them. So there's an understanding that there's a pointing towards a value to order, and God's order would be the ultimate order in this. So
that finishes this particular chapter.
We've answered it, right?
Yeah. Or at least
I told you just wait until next chapter, and this was the one. So.
Right. Yeah. So that's chapter 17. The next chapter is chapter 18, and he's going to talk about living with moral nihilism.
Yeah.
Right? So moral nihilism is the idea that there isn't any morals, right?
And, nothing matters. Yeah. Everything.
No morals. It doesn't exist. Maybe it's an illusion, or it's a feeling that we have about things, but they really don't exist. So we will pick this up next time with chapter 18, talking about living with moral nihilism, and see where he goes from there. Right?
Yeah. Again, all the places interact with: Facebook, Twitter, YouTube have comment sections. You're maybe listening to this on iTunes or your favorite podcast one. So if you want to go our website, again, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and interact. And what's your kind of take on this? Did he answer the objections well? What are some critiques that you might have of this? We'd like to know. We'd like to interact with you, and maybe do them kind of towards the end of the book, and see where both believer and unbeliever might have questions or issues with the argumentation. So, also
for those of you who have subscribed to our channel and our various podcasts and that sort of thing, we really do appreciate it. And
absolutely,
thank you.
Yeah.
So we appreciate that.
Thanks for sharing our stuff too. It's appreciated. Again, continue on the road to the cave, from the cave to the cross, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.